Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. North Korea fired a series of missiles, including what is claimed to be hypersonic. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said these launches are repeated violations of UN Security Council resolutions and said North Korea is increasing insecurity and instability in the region. And while Kim Jong-un seems to be communicating outward messages, the North Korean human rights issues are expected to be discussed at the ongoing United Nations General Assembly later this month. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Roberta Cohen. Ms. Cohen was former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. Also, she was previously with Brookings Institution, specializing in human rights, humanitarian, and refugee issues. Jieun Baek also joins me today. Dr. Baek is a fellow with the Korea Project at Harvard Kennedy School's Belpercenter. She is also the founder of Lumen, a nonprofit organization that works to make information available to North Korean people. Thank you for being with us. Good to have you both. In the latest move, North Korea said it has fired a new type of anti-aircraft missile. North Korea has recently ratcheted up tensions by conducting its first test launch of a hypersonic missile earlier this week, just 2 weeks after firing two short-range ballistic missiles. Ms. Cohen, North Korea has been launching a series of missiles. What were your first thoughts?
My first thoughts were that the leadership believes that a militarily powerful North Korea is what's needed to ensure attention to and survival of the Kim regime. After all, North Korea is going through desperate economic times because of its COVID lockdown and isolation. Millions are without sufficient food, and should there be an outbreak of COVID, the health system does not have the capacity. Yet here's the Kim regime testing ballistic missiles and wanting to be accepted as a nuclear state. Its justification that the outside world is hostile is most likely a message also intended for domestic consumption, because so many must be at a breaking point.
In a speech at the North Korean Supreme People's Assembly, the leader Kim Jong-un said that inter-Korean hotlines with South Korea will be restored, but at the same time, he said the U.S. hostile policy towards Pyongyang has not changed. Dr. Baek, what do you think the North Korean regime is trying to say?
It goes back to what was stated earlier, that they want to, it seems like the regime has been and continues to want to be recognized as a normal state, as a peer state of the countries that they call their enemies, as a recognized nuclear weapons state. And when times go quiet, when there's a suspension of hostilities and tensions, whether it's intentional or not, they seem to want to draw attention back to the forefront of the attention of the United States, South Korea, and others in the region. And right now, with the elections in South Korea, the presidential elections coming up in South Korea early next year, and just a slew of foreign policy and domestic policy priorities in the United States, I think this may be one of North Korea's tried and true tactics of trying to get the attention of the United States and South Korea when attention seems to go elsewhere.
Ms. Cohen, the North Korean regime has publicly admitted that their economy is in a dire situation, as Dr. Baek earlier mentioned, yet they continue to pursue their nuclear and missile programs. What does this tell you?
It tells me that any reform-oriented economic ideas and measures seem to be sidelined. The former German ambassador to North Korea, Thomas Scheffer, who spent 8 years there until 2018, he just published a book that finds it impossible to take seriously government promises to develop the economy and raise living standards. Outsiders, he says, sometimes tout these promises. He calls them a fiction, since spending on nuclear armament is clearly increased and spending on the civilian economy has decreased. The defense spending, moreover, may be undermining economic progress and has resulted in UN sanctions, which have impacted the economy. Schaffer says the hardliners in North Korea have become dominant.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said while the U.S. is evaluating the missile launches, the launches are repeated violations of UN Security Council resolutions. Dr. Baek, do you think the U.S. should respond more strongly, or is there a more appropriate way to respond to North Korea's provocation?
I think that the U.S. Can respond more strongly, but it doesn't have to be immediate. The U.S. Does not need to act on someone else's timeline, especially that of North Korea. And so I think also just another show of power is not going to change anything, especially when it comes to North Korea. And it just points to the need for a much more long-term policy or a long-term view on how to address the North Korea challenge. I know it's a very multifaceted challenge, but primarily the weapons and the human rights situation. There needs to be a much more long-term solution. But yes, I think having a measured approach that's multilateral in nature was appropriate for the response at this time.
All right. And Dr. Baek, in your latest report, you said North Korea's nuclear program and North Korea's human rights issues are inseparable. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So North Korea's nuclear weapons program and their weapons program overall wouldn't be where they are today if they did not engage in chronically depriving its population of resources and engaging in systematic abuses. And if they didn't engage in systematic abuses against its population, the regime wouldn't be so fearful of external interventions or potentially internal uprisings or desire for change. And ultimately, it points to one common core problem, which is the nature of the regime itself. I'm not calling for a need for regime change by any means, but what needs to change is the fundamental relationship between the North Korean regime and its people, the way they treat its people. There's been many people who have said the following point, including Dr. Chung Pak at the State Department now. And she said this point before she joined the State Department, but it seems like the Kim family or the Kim regime is most fearful of its own people, not the US, not South Korea, but its own people. And so continues to engage in all these hostile policies towards its people as a means to justify their weapons program so that they can ultimately keep the regime as it is in the hands of the Kim family. And so this common core problem is, I think, what needs to be the forefront of how we engage North Korea, which is how do we change the fundamental relationship between the regime and its people as a way to bring more, not even more, just a baseline of freedom for its people, and also try to transform the regime in a way where it would be much more likely to engage in less hostile relationships between its neighboring countries and the United States.
Ms. Cohen, currently the United Nations General Assembly is taking place, and the North Korean human rights issue is expected to be discussed at the third committee this month. What is the most urgent topic that should be discussed there?
I would like to see discussed the impact of North Korea's current food shortages on political prisoners. UN General Assembly resolutions since 2015 have listed political prisoners as one of the most vulnerable groups when it comes to food and healthcare in North Korea. The UN Secretary General's report to the General Assembly this year has warned that the risks to detainees become greater when the food situation becomes more dire for the general population. Access for the International Committee of the Red Cross, the World Food Program, and NGOs to camps and detention facilities should be called for. North Korea itself in 2019, and this is not well known, accepted a recommendation at a UN process, the Universal Periodic Review, that it allow humanitarian organizations to reach the most vulnerable, including prisoners.
Just adding to what Ms. Cohen has remarked right now. So in addition to the most vulnerable people, which of course are the political prisoners, and as she mentioned, there are on the ground stories coming out, or not stories, reporting coming out that more political prisons are being built in recent times. People are desperate, and it calls for humanitarian aid, except humanitarian aid, I think, ought to come with conditions, with much more transparent monitoring by external actors and so forth. But I think people are able to make a link on the ground between the COVID situation and the food shortages, but not necessarily with the nuclear weapons program and food shortages.
Right. And Dr. Baek, if the North Korean human rights resolution is adopted at the UN General Assembly this month, it'll be for 17 years in a row. However, we don't see much of change on the North Korean side despite all that. Why do you think that is the case?
I think it goes back to the nature of the regime. The regime, they have adopted very superficial and superficial changes in language. They've adopted some, international human rights language, saying that they've done some, they value women's rights and rights of children and persons with disabilities and so forth. This is lip service, and these are the most vulnerable people inside North Korea who remain very vulnerable. I think that the lack of any substantive change in the lives of North Korean peoples as it pertains to rights, it speaks to the nature of the regime. The more they open up in terms of providing people with more rights, the more vulnerable that they may become, or they may perceive that they become. And so these two things are mutually exclusive to one another. The regime survival as it is in the Kim family with the systems in place right now, and a population that's freer. The regime seems to fear its people most. And so we need to figure out a way as an international community, in addition to pressuring them to change, to figure out how to incentivize the regime to substantively improve the rights of its people. And I think that's a challenge that is posed to all the viewers and the international community at large.
Right. Do you think it is sufficiently done in the UN, or is there anything else to be done?
Well, let me say that at the United Nations, international pressure has and it can help. As soon as UN resolutions began to speak of crimes against humanity beginning in 2014 and call for the referral of the North Korean situation to the International Criminal Court, North Korean officials began to pay attention. And they took a number of positive, albeit minimal steps. They revised some laws, and that's true. Maybe that has helped someone on detention, women, children, disabilities. They allowed entry to a UN rapporteur on disabilities. They provided reports on their compliance with UN treaties. They participated in and accepted recommendations at a UN process I referred to before, the Universal Periodic Review. What the UN needs to do is press for implementation of the recommendations that are made to North Korea. And there's an opening when the UN organizations are on the ground. They are not right now because of the COVID. They should be back on the ground. And when they are, they actually have a strategic framework, the UN agencies do, with the North Korean government that actually opens the door to their lending to support to improvements in human rights. So the UN needs to press for implementation of recommendations more than it's done, and also at the same time to lay the groundwork for eventual prosecutions. The threat of accountability can act as a deterrent to some abuse, and there are some anecdotal reports like that. But at the same time, the UN should seek to engage with North Korea more fully, provide training, technical assistance, work with its officials to improve its record in as much as they can. And there are various openings for UN agencies to do this. And there are officials in North Korea who no doubt would like to see reforms, or at least believe that North Korea will gain some aid from the international community, even some support, if they undertake reforms.
Mm-hmm. But Ms. Cohen, North Korea has been refusing to be transparent or being fully open the ground to the UN workers. How can we make North Korea comply with the international standards?
If you look at the strategic framework between the UN and North Korea, this goes from 2017 to 2021. It actually gives the UN an opportunity in the human rights area to help North Korea in better its compliance with its international obligations under UN treaties and also at the Universal Periodic Review. My question is, once the UN is back on the ground, and as we know, they are not there now, once they're back on the ground, I think they have a stronger role to play with the backup of headquarters from the UN to work with North Korea in technical assistance and training programs. North Korea did participate in the training program in Geneva in 2019, having to do with their participation in the Universal Periodic Review. There are ways to introduce and try to use as much as you can the opportunities that do exist. I don't even feel those are fully utilized by the UN because the UN too often is fearful of in any way irritating the North Korean government, and they often don't have the backup at headquarters to do so.
Earlier this year, Secretary Blinken said human rights are at the center of the U.S. foreign policy, and he even said people in North Korea continue to suffer widespread and systematic abuses at the hands of a repressive government. Ms. Cohen, what should be the role of the U.S. in improving the human rights situation in North Korea?
Well, first, the U.S. should reappoint a special envoy for human rights in North Korea. The position has been vacant the last 4 years. And that envoy is important to help integrate human rights into governmental policies and also work for greater coherence with allies like South Korea. The Moon-Biden joint statement in May agreed to Washington and Seoul working together to improve the human rights situation in North Korea, but this is not yet achieved. And meanwhile, North Korea seeks to drive a wedge between its allies. At the United Nations, a strategy will be needed that includes regular official Security Council meetings on human rights in North Korea. And that's something that the Special Envoy, again, would get heavily involved in. And the U.S. should increase information going into North Korea, since that's such a critical way to promote change in the country.
All right. And Dr. Baek, my last question. You most recently released a report called Policy of Public Diplomacy with North Korea. What are the things that can be newly done by the U.S. government in regards to this?
The major point on this was that there is a need to implement a large-scale policy on public diplomacy with this country as a means to lay down the foundational groundwork to seek long-term policy objectives being materialized in North Korea. That's in the interest of the U.S., our allies, as well as the people of North Korea. We, at the core of this is the welfare of North Korean people who are living in a very, very dire environment. And so this proposes nothing new, really. This is actually not a new policy that this report is propounding, but is actually just recommending to scale up existing and somewhat fragmented efforts inside and outside of the U.S. government, which is, activities that are intended to inform, influence foreign audiences. And this is basically this is good for a couple reasons. One, it's trying to ramp up a very effective, very cost-effective policy that we know works. And by that, we mean, we know it opens up, it provides North Korean people with access to real news, real information, and that can empower them to be the authors of their own lives and their country's future. And secondly, we know that this can help lay down the groundworks to try to shape the North Korean regime's behavior in the long term to become a more normal country that is accountable to its people and accountable to countries in its region as well as the United States.
And in its latest meeting of the Supreme People's Assembly, North Korea discussed adopting laws on youth education. The youth education law is widely thought to be one of the measures North Korean leader Kim Jong-un trying to implement in order to control the country's new generation of people in their 20s and 30s. Ms. Cohen and Dr. Baek, thank you so much for being with us today. And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.